On the 11th of May, 1979, a 66-year-old woman died of a heart attack in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She had spent her final months in bed, too frail to stand, surrounded by half-empty glasses of Coca-Cola and stacks of books no one believed she still read. When the end came, the news barely registered. 10 people attended her funeral. One biographer later wrote that $3,500 was all that remained in her bank account. At the age of 21, she had been worth approximately $50 million. Her name was Barbara Woolworth Hutton, and in her lifetime, she had owned palaces in 8 countries, worn jewels that once belonged to Empress Josephine, and married 7 men, among them a prince, a count, a baron, a playboy, an actor, and a man who may have been the most dangerous of all. She had been called the poor little rich girl by every newspaper in America, a nickname she despised and could never escape. The mathematics of her ruin are almost impossible to comprehend. $50 million in 1933, adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of over $1 billion today. And yet by the time they found her in that hotel suite, the money was gone. Not invested, not donated, gone. She did not gamble it away at casinos. She did not lose it in a single catastrophic business failure. She spent it slowly and methodically, the way a person might spend the hours of their life, without fully realizing, until very near the end, that the supply was finite. What follows is not a story about money. It is a story about what happens when a child is given everything except the one thing she needed most. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. This channel is trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month. 1,000 people who believe that stories like this one deserve to be told carefully, told honestly, told the way history actually felt. If this is the kind of story you came here for, hitting that subscribe button right now would mean more than you know. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to what we're building here. Now, back to where we were, because what happened next changes everything. Chapter 1. The Empire of Five and Dime. To understand Barbara Hutton, you must first understand the man she never met. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born in 1852 on a subsistence farm in upstate New York, the son of people who knew poverty the way most people know their own names, intimately, and without any expectation that it might change. He received almost no formal education past his early teenage years. He had no family connections, no inherited capital, and no particular talent that anyone around him could identify. What he had was an idea so simple that when he first proposed it to his employer, the man laughed at him. The idea was this: place the merchandise on the counter where customers could touch it, price everything at 5 cents or 10 cents, accept no credit, and move enough volume to make the low margins work. His employer tried it as a test, humoring him. In a single day, the goods sold out. Frank Woolworth took that lesson and built one of the largest retail empires in American history. By the time the Woolworth Building opened in Manhattan in 1913, then the tallest building in the world, paid for in cash, there were over 1,000 Woolworth stores across the United States, Canada, and England. He had not borrowed his way to the top. He had not charmed investors or cultivated powerful allies. He had simply outworked, outdisciplined, and outendured everyone around him, decade after decade, until the world had no choice but to acknowledge what he had built. He was not a warm man. His employees feared him. His family, when they are described by the historians who studied them, tend to use words like formal, distant, and severe. He demanded low wholesale prices, paid cash on delivery, and maintained iron control over every aspect of his stores. There was no sentimentality in his business operations, and there was very little of it in his personal life either. His daughter Edna, however, was another matter entirely. Edna Woolworth was everything her father was not: socially ambitious, artistically inclined, deeply hungry for the kind of refinement that old American money conferred and new American money could only approximate. She married Franklin Laws Hutton, a stockbroker and co-founder of the investment firm F. Hutton and Company, and immediately set about constructing the kind of life that would have been unimaginable on her father's upstate New York farm. They traveled. They entertained. They accumulated the trappings of a class to which they technically now belonged, but still felt they were auditioning for. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, 1 year before her grandfather's skyscraper opened, 1 year before the family's triumph was complete. She came into a world already shaped by her grandfather's iron will and her parents' restless social climbing, and from her earliest years, The contradictions of that inheritance were stamped into her experience. Frank Woolworth died in 1919, when Barbara was 6 years old. He left behind a fortune that, divided among his heirs, would make each of them extraordinarily wealthy. But his death was not the defining loss of Barbara's childhood. That came 1 year later, in 1921, when Barbara was 8 years old. Her mother, Edna, was found dead in her bedroom in their New York townhouse, having taken an overdose of substances the family immediately and firmly declined to discuss in public. Barbara was not told the full truth of what had happened. She was simply told that her mother was gone. She was 8 years old, and she was, in that single morning, fundamentally and permanently altered. The effect of this loss cannot be overstated, though it has often been understated by the people who have written about Barbara Hutton in the decades since her death. They focus on the jewels and the husbands and the palace in Tangier. They count the millions and tally the marriages. They construct the familiar narrative of the heiress who could not manage her own affairs, shallow, self-indulgent, naive. But what they tend to skip past, or mention only in a paragraph, is that underneath all of it was a little girl who had lost her mother before she understood what loss meant, and who spent the remaining 58 years of her life searching for something to fill that particular absence. Her father, Franklin Hutton, had no idea what to do with her. He was not cruel, exactly, but he was thoroughly unsuited to single parenthood and made almost no attempt to disguise the fact. Barbara was shuffled between relatives and nannies and boarding schools, spending summers with her Aunt Marjorie. The formidable Marjorie Merriweather Post, one of the wealthiest women in America, and school years in a succession of institutions that were excellent by every measurable standard and cold in every way that mattered. She was, by all accounts, an exceptionally perceptive child. She noticed everything. She remembered everything. And she understood, far earlier than she should have been required to, that the people who surrounded her were primarily interested in the fortune that would one day be hers, rather than in the person she might become. At school, she wrote poetry. Quiet, private work, composed in notebooks she did not share with anyone. The poems, read decades later by the biographers who finally gained access to them, are startling in their emotional precision. She wrote about loneliness in voices that did not sound like a child's. She wrote about belonging to a world that did not belong to her. She was, underneath the inheritance and the public spectacle that was coming, a poet. A perceptive, isolated, motherless poet. And the world was about to make it very, very hard for her to remain one. Chapter 2. The Debut and the Price of Spectacle. In December of 1930, Barbara Hutton turned 18, and her father did what wealthy fathers in that era were expected to do. He gave her a coming-out party. Not a party in the conventional sense. A production. A spectacle so extreme that it would be discussed, dissected, and condemned for years afterward. The venue was the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City. The decor had been designed by Joseph Urban, the same man who designed sets for the Metropolitan Opera. Over 1,000 guests attended. The entertainment included performances by 2 full orchestras, and the flowers alone, thousands of imported roses and lilies, cost a sum that newspapers immediately and gleefully published for public consumption. The total cost of the party is variously estimated at between $60,000 and $200,000, depending on the source. Even the lower figure, in $1930, represents an almost incomprehensible expenditure. The Great Depression had been underway for over a year. Unemployment across the United States was approaching levels that would not be fully reckoned with for another 2 years. Bread lines had already formed in New York, blocks from the Ritz-Carlton. Men were selling apples on the street corners of Manhattan for a nickel apiece. At a time when millions of Americans could not afford to feed their families, the Hutton debut was an act of breathtaking tone-deafness. The press responded accordingly. Newspapers that had been happy to treat the Woolworth fortune as a charming American success story turned on the family with a ferocity that clearly surprised Franklin Hutton, who had orchestrated the party without, apparently, any serious consideration of its optics. Editorials called it obscene. Cartoonists had a field day. The phrase "poor little rich girl," first applied to Hutton by the columnist Odd McIntyre, attached itself to her immediately and with the adhesive permanence of a nickname that captures something true, however unfairly. Barbara, who had been consulted almost not at all in the planning of the event that would define her public image for the next 5 decades, was photographed smiling in her gown and her pearls. And the photograph was reproduced in papers across the country alongside captions that made clear the public had already decided what to think of her. What few people noticed at the time was that Barbara also wrote. She had been composing poetry since her school years, quiet, private work that stood in sharp contrast to the public theater of her life. She was not the simpering socialite of the caricatures. She read voraciously, spoke 4 languages, and possessed a quality of attention to the people around her that those who knew her well consistently describe with something approaching awe. She remembered birthdays, not just of friends but of the household staff. She noticed when someone was unhappy. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. None of this appeared in the newspapers. None of it fit the story the newspapers were already telling. She came into her full inheritance at 21 in 1933, and the figure announced in the press was $50 million. In the context of the Depression, when a family of 4 might subsist on $500 a year, $50 million was not merely wealth. It was a number so large it had left the category of money and entered the category of mythology. It was also, as Barbara would eventually discover, a number that attracted a very specific kind of person. She had, by the time she turned 21, already begun to understand something important about her situation, that she would never entirely know of the people who sought her company, which of them were there for her and which of them were there for the number. This uncertainty, which might have been manageable in a person with a stable foundation of self-worth, was for Barbara Hutton a wound that never properly healed. Her mother had left without warning. Her father had been absent even when present. And now the world was pressing toward her with open hands, and she could not distinguish the genuine from the grasping, and she was not sure she ever would. In 1933, the year she came into her money, she married for the first time. His name was Alexis Mdivani, and he was one of 3 brothers from Soviet Georgia who had arrived in Europe in the early 1920s, claiming royal lineage that historians have since been largely unable to verify, and who had proceeded to systematically work their way through the wealthiest women on the continent. The Mdivani brothers were spectacularly handsome, utterly charming, and almost completely without conscience when it came to financial matters. They had already acquired the nickname the Marrying Mdivanis in the European press, and their intentions, if that is even the right word for something so transparently transactional, were known to virtually everyone in the social world Barbara was entering. Everyone, it seemed, except Barbara. Or perhaps she knew, and married him anyway, because he was beautiful and attentive and said the things she needed to hear, and because at 21 years old, motherless since 8 and lonely since birth, the prospect of being loved, even by a man who was performing love rather than feeling it, was more than she could resist. They were married in Paris in June of 1933. The settlement Alexis received as part of the arrangement, negotiated with the cheerful mercenary efficiency of a business transaction, amounted to approximately $1 million. It was the first payment in what would become a very long series. Chapter 3. The Marrying Mdivanis and the Education of Barbara Hutton. The marriage to Alexis Mdivani lasted 2 years, and in those 2 years Barbara Hutton received an education that no finishing school could have provided. She learned, slowly and painfully, what it meant to be married to a man who had calculated the value of the relationship before it began. Alexis was not, to be fair to him in the narrow way that fairness sometimes requires, entirely without affection for her. Those who observed them closely in the early months of the marriage noted moments of genuine warmth between them. He could be funny. He could be tender. He was also, simultaneously, spending her money with a freedom that suggested he had never seriously distinguished between hers and his. A confusion that, in a man who had pursued her specifically for her wealth, carries a particular kind of audacity. The couple traveled constantly. Paris, London, the French Riviera, Morocco. They occupied suites in the finest hotels, hosted dinners for hundreds of guests, and maintained a lifestyle of such sustained extravagance that even Barbara's enormous fortune began, for the first time, to show signs of strain at the edges. She renovated a townhouse in London. She purchased jewelry, extraordinary jewelry, because jewelry was the one acquisition that felt both beautiful and permanent, beauty made solid and undeniable. The pearls, the emeralds, the diamonds that had histories of their own. She also, in 1934, gave birth to a son. Lance Reventlow came into the world in February of that year, and Barbara's response to his arrival was the most unambiguous thing she experienced in those 2 years. She adored him immediately and completely. Those who were present in those early months describe a woman transformed, less guarded, less brittle, genuinely joyful in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in public. Lance was real in a way that so much of her life was not. He needed her in a way that no one had needed her before, at least not for anything other than her money. But even this was complicated immediately by circumstance. Alexis, who had shown only sporadic interest in the pregnancy, showed even less in the child once he arrived. And the social world Barbara inhabited, the constant movement, the parties, the obligation to be seen, was not easily reconciled with the quieter rhythms of early motherhood. Lance was cared for by nurses, as was standard in that class and era. Barbara saw him, but not as much as she wanted. Not as much as she needed, for her own sake as much as his. The marriage to Alexis ended in 1935, confirmed in a divorce that his lawyers had clearly been preparing for some time. The financial settlement was substantial. Barbara, advised by lawyers who were perhaps less aggressive than the situation warranted, paid it without prolonged resistance. She was 22 years old, divorced, and the mother of a 1-year-old son. She was also, for approximately 5 minutes, single. The second husband was Count Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat whose title was real, unlike Alexis Mdivani's dubious Georgian royal claims, and whose personality was something considerably darker. Barbara had met him on the social circuit, where he was known as handsome, athletic, and temperamentally difficult. The word that appears most often in the accounts of people who knew him is controlling. Not in the casual modern sense of the word, but in the serious, systematic sense. A man who set about, from early in the relationship, structuring Barbara's world to increase her dependence on him and decrease her contact with anyone who might give her a perspective that differed from his own. He would prove far more dangerous than the first. She married him in May of 1935, less than 3 months after her divorce from Alexis was finalized. The speed of the remarriage is striking, though perhaps it should not be surprising. Barbara had grown up without a stable home. She was constitutionally oriented toward attachment, toward the idea of a partner, toward the shape of a family, even when the available raw materials were clearly inadequate. She wanted to be loved. She wanted, underneath all of it, to stop being alone. Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow looked, from a certain distance, like someone who could provide what she was looking for. From a closer distance, he looked like something else entirely. The pattern of the marriage became clear quickly, at least to those on the outside of it. He controlled her finances where he could get access to them, challenged her on her relationships with friends he deemed unsuitable, and deployed a combination of jealousy and coldness with what seemed, to observers, like a methodical precision. Barbara, whose childhood had given her a particularly strong susceptibility to the withdrawal of affection as a form of punishment, responded to his coldness by working harder to please him, a dynamic that gave him enormous power and gave her very little. She gave birth to no more children. She spent money. She threw parties that were photographed and reported on, and in the photographs she is smiling, and the smile tells you nothing. In the background of all of this, rarely mentioned and never foreground, Lance was growing up in a household that was, by any reasonable measure, not well. He would one day become the most important person in her life, and she would outlive him. But that is a chapter that belongs later in this story. For now, the third husband was waiting. Chapter 4. Cary Grant and the Brief Dream of Normalcy. The divorce from Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow was finalized in 1941, and it was, by the standards of Barbara's marriages, neither clean nor inexpensive. Kurt had retained aggressive legal representation. The custody arrangement for Lance, fought over with a bitterness that affected the boy in ways that would take years to fully manifest, was resolved in Barbara's favor, though the legal struggle left marks on everyone it touched. And then, improbably, almost inexplicably, she met Cary Grant. Archibald Leach, which was his real name, the name he had carried out of Bristol, England, where he had grown up in poverty more grinding than most of Barbara's acquaintances could have imagined, had reinvented himself so completely that the reinvention was the man. Cary Grant was not a persona he wore over his real self. Cary Grant was, by 1941, more real to him than Archibald Leach had ever been. He was the most effortlessly charming man in Hollywood, which is a category with serious competition. He was also, by those who knew him well, described as guarded, complex, and fundamentally private in ways that his public image, as the embodiment of cosmopolitan ease, entirely concealed. They were, in other words, a matched set of contradictions. Two people who presented polished surfaces to the world and kept the difficult interiors carefully out of view. They married in July of 1942, at the height of World War II, in a ceremony at Barbara's Lake Tahoe estate. The tabloids responded with the particular delight that celebrity pairings generate. calling them cash and carry, a nickname both parties found tedious immediately. The press constructed an obvious narrative. The heiress and the movie star, the old money and the new fame, the sad rich girl finally, perhaps, getting what she needed. For a while, the narrative was not entirely wrong. Those who observed them in the early years of the marriage described something that looks, in the accounts, like genuine affection. Grant was attentive in ways that Alexis had only performed and Kurt had used as a weapon. He was interested in Barbara's poetry, her reading, her opinions. He had not come from money, and he did not treat hers with the complicated proprietary attitude that her previous husbands had brought to it. He had his own career, his own income, his own identity that existed entirely outside of her fortune. And this made him different in a way Barbara found deeply restful. For approximately 2 years, she was something approaching happy. The differences that attracted them, however, were also the differences that would eventually become fractures. Grant was disciplined in ways Barbara was not, or could not be. He was punctual. He was careful with money, or at least he had been trained by poverty to think carefully about it, which is not quite the same thing but produces some of the same behaviors. He was sober in his habits. Barbara was not. By the early 1940s, the use of sedatives that had begun as a medical recommendation for anxiety had become a sustained dependency that shaped her days in ways that were not always obvious from the outside, but were increasingly visible to those who lived alongside her. They wanted different things. This is the simplest way to put it, and also the most accurate. Grant wanted a home. Barbara wanted motion. Grant wanted quiet evenings. Barbara wanted parties, crowds, the constant noise that kept the inner quiet at bay. Grant wanted to understand her. Barbara, who had spent her entire life not being fully understood by anyone, was not entirely sure she wanted to be. They separated in 1944 and divorced in 1945. The settlement, this time, was different. Grant accepted nothing from Barbara's fortune, a gesture that she later described as one of the kindest things anyone had ever done for her, because it meant the affection had been real. He had not needed her money. He had simply needed someone different. She was 32 years old. She had been married 3 times. She had a son she was raising across 2 continents. She had a fortune that was still large but no longer quite as enormous as it had been. And she had a heart that was, by this point, beginning to show the damage. The sedatives helped with the nights. The parties helped with the days. The jewelry helped in the way that beautiful objects help, by providing evidence that the world contains loveliness, which is not nothing. She married for the 4th time in 1947. Prince Igor Trubetskoy was a Lithuanian aristocrat and competitive cyclist, a combination that might sound improbable, but accurately describes the man. The marriage lasted 3 years. It produced no children. It produced no particular happiness. It produced, like all of the others, a legal dissolution that cost Barbara money she did not monitor closely enough to notice was running low. The 5th husband, Porfirio Rubirosa, is the name that appears most often when people discuss Barbara Hutton's life, because Rubirosa was the kind of man who attracted attention the way certain plants attract insects. Automatically, and through chemical processes that bypassed conscious evaluation entirely. He was Dominican. He was charming. He was connected, through his first marriage, to the family of the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. He had subsequently married the tobacco heiress Doris Duke, Barbara's primary competitor for the title of richest girl in America, divorced her, and was, by 1953, actively pursuing Barbara with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was pursuing. Barbara knew his reputation. Everyone did. She married him anyway.
Chapter 5. Rubirosa and the Anatomy of Self-Destruction. Porfirio Rubirosa was, by most accounts, one of the most effective social predators of the 20th century, though the word predator implies a calculation that may be slightly too cold. He genuinely liked women. He genuinely enjoyed the social world he inhabited. He was funny, physically magnetic, and possessed of an attention span for whichever woman he was with that felt, in the moment, like total devotion. The attention was real enough. It was simply not, as it turned out, particularly exclusive. The marriage lasted 73 days. 73 days, in which Barbara gave him a 10-acre estate in Paris, a stable of polo ponies, a string of sports cars, and a check for $2.5 million. The check was later disputed by biographers trying to determine the full accounting of the Hutton fortune's dissipation. What is not disputed is that Rubirosa left the marriage significantly wealthier than he entered it, and that Barbara's accountants, during this period, began sending her letters with increasing urgency about the rate at which the fortune was diminishing. She did not read the letters carefully, or she read them, she did not absorb them, or did not act on them. This is the part of the Barbara Hutton story that her sympathizers find most difficult to defend and her critics find easiest to condemn: the sheer, sustained inattention to financial reality that characterized the middle and later decades of her life. But consider the context. She had never been taught to think about money as a finite resource, because throughout her childhood and young adulthood it had functioned as effectively infinite. When it ran low, she felt not so much alarmed as surprised, the way a person who has never experienced winter is surprised by frost. And the advisors and accountants who surrounded her were not, in many cases, working in her interest. Several of them, over the years, were found to have skimmed from her accounts in ways that became apparent only years later, when the damage had been thoroughly consolidated. She was generous to a degree that those who worked for her consistently describe with something approaching awe. The gifts she gave, not to husbands but to friends, employees, strangers who caught her attention with their difficulties, were extraordinary in both scale and thoughtfulness. She financed the education of children she had met casually at charity events. She covered medical expenses for household staff she had not employed in years. She gave jewelry to friends undergoing personal crises, not as a gesture, but as a practical response. This will help you, take it. The giving was not self-destruction. Or rather, it was not only self-destruction. Some of it was simply generosity, the unencumbered kind that very wealthy people rarely maintain because their advisors talk them out of it. Barbara never allowed her advisors to talk her out of it, partly because she did not pay close enough attention to what they were saying, and partly because the giving was, for her, one of the few expressions of power that felt morally clean. The sixth husband was German tennis champion Baron Gottfried von Kram, whom she married in 1955. Von Kram was, by the accounts of virtually everyone who knew him, a genuinely decent man, principled in a way that had cost him considerably during the Nazi era, when he had refused certain political affiliations and paid for the refusal. He and Barbara were, for several years, something approaching content. They traveled. They attended the events that their social world required. They were kind to each other in the measured way of two people who understand that kindness is what they can reliably offer and warmth, the deeper thing, is harder to sustain. The marriage ended in 1959. The accounting of why is diffuse and somewhat sad. Accumulated incompatibilities, the usual erosion, the difficulty of maintaining connection across the permanent motion of Barbara's life. She was, by 1960, 47 years old and 6 marriages into the project of finding someone to be with in the way she needed to be with someone. The fortune, which had begun at $50 million, was, by the estimates of the most rigorous financial analysts who have reconstructed it since, somewhere in the range of $15 to $20 million. Still large. Still, in theory, more than enough to sustain her for the rest of her life in extraordinary comfort. In theory. What was also happening, underneath the marriages and the parties and the jewels sold and regifted and sold again, was a slow physical deterioration that those who saw her regularly were beginning to mention to each other in worried tones. She was thin, too thin, in the way that suggests not so much conscious restraint as a fundamental loss of appetite for sustenance. The sedatives had accumulated into a dependency that required management rather than satisfaction. She moved through her days in a way that observers describe as present, but somehow not fully there, like a woman viewing her own life through a pane of slightly frosted glass. And Lance was by this point grown. He had become a racing car driver, a decision that his mother found simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, and had built a life that was his own in a way she respected and found, when she was honest with herself, slightly wounding. He did not need her. He loved her, she knew that. But he had constructed an existence that did not require her presence at its center, and she understood, with the particular acuity she brought to emotional realities, what that meant. The 7th husband was coming. He would be the last.
Chapter 6. Raymond Doan and the Final Attempt. Raymond Doan Vin na Champasak was a Laotian artist whom Barbara met in Tangier in the early 1960s, during one of her extended stays at Sidi Hosni, the palace she had purchased in the Medina of the Old City and renovated over a period of years into one of the most extraordinary private residences in North Africa. Tangier itself, in that period, was a place where various kinds of people who had run out of other options came to reconstruct themselves in the tolerant ambiguity of the international zone. Expatriates and exiles, artists and adventurers, people who needed a city that asked few questions. Barbara had first come to Tangier in the 1940s and had fallen into a relationship with the city that was unlike her relationship with anywhere else. It was warm. It was beautiful in a way that felt earned rather than curated. The people she gathered around her there were, by several accounts, among the most genuine human connections of her adult life. She had learned some Arabic. She knew the vendors in the market by name. She moved through the Medina with a comfort and a directness that stood in sharp contrast to the performing she did in Paris or London or New York. In Tangier, she could be something closer to herself. It was there that she married Raymond Doan in 1964, in a ceremony she approached with a combination of genuine affection and a weariness she made little effort to conceal. She was 51 years old. This was her 7th marriage. She did not dress it in the elaborate theatrical production of her earlier unions. It was quiet by her standards, almost private. The marriage lasted 3 years and ended without significant drama, which made it somewhat unusual in the context of her history. Raymond Doan was, by the accounts available, not a bad man. He was not financially predatory in the manner of Alexis or Rubirosa. He was not controlling in the manner of Kurt. He and Barbara had a genuine connection, rooted in shared aesthetic sensibilities and an appreciation for the particular magic of Tangier. And when it became clear that the connection could not sustain the weight of a marriage, they separated without the scorched earth legal combat that had characterized her earlier divorces. She was, after 1967, finished with marriage. Not because she had given up on connection. She never gave up on connection entirely, but because she had run out of the specific energy that marrying required. The ceremony, the hope, the subsequent management of disappointment. What she had instead was Tangier and the palace and the garden that she had planted herself and tended with genuine care. She had her books, which she continued to read voraciously even as her health declined. She had a small circle of friends who were, by the accounts of those who knew her in this period, genuinely fond of her and not primarily interested in what she could give them. She had Lance. And then, on May 24, 1972, Lance Reventlow was killed in a plane crash near Aspen, Colorado. He was 36 years old. Chapter 7. The Death of Lance and the End of Barbara Hutton. There are losses from which people do not recover. This is a truth that those who have not experienced such a loss tend to underestimate, because the mind, mercifully, cannot fully simulate the experience of grief it has not had. Barbara Hutton had known loss her entire life. Her mother at 8, the succession of marriages that each ended in their own specific variety of abandonment. But nothing in her history had prepared her for the death of her son, because nothing could have. Lance was the one relationship in her life that had been, from her side, entirely without calculation or ambivalence. She had loved him the way she had never managed to love the husbands or be loved by them. Completely, and without protecting herself from the consequences of that completeness. He was the one person in the world she did not worry about losing to the fortune. He had never needed her money in the way the husbands had. He had his own racing career, his own friends, his own life. He had loved her back, as much as a son can love a mother who is simultaneously devoted and frequently absent, which is a complicated kind of love but a real one. When the news came from Aspen, Barbara was at Sidi Hosni. According to those present, she did not speak for several days. She moved through the palace in a silence that was different from her usual quiet. She did not read. She did not eat, not really. She sat in the garden she had planted with such care and looked at it without seeing it. The people around her moved carefully, the way people move around something that might shatter. Her health, already fragile, deteriorated sharply in the months that followed. The weight loss accelerated. The dependence on sedatives deepened. She had always been thin. Now she became something beyond thin, something that alarmed the people who saw her and that she seemed either unable or unwilling to address. She was 59 years old, and she looked considerably older, in the way that grief aged her beyond what time alone had managed. She had been consumed by her life for decades. The marriages, the fortune, the jewelry, the palaces. All of it had circled around her like a gorgeous, suffocating orbit. Now the orbit was thinning. The money was nearly gone, spent down through the settlements and the generosity and the inattention and the advisors who had helped themselves along the way. The jewels had been sold, many of them, over the preceding decade. The great pieces that had defined her image, the emeralds and the pearls and the diamonds with their histories. His mother's grief, unlike the cars, left no physical trace. It simply consumed what remained. She sold Sidi Hosni in the mid-1970s, a decision that those who loved her describe as the last signal they needed that something essential had been surrendered. The palace was not just a property. It was the one place she had felt fully at home in her adult life. Its sale marked, in a way that is hard to articulate but easy to feel, the final letting go of the idea that there was still a life to be constructed. She moved to hotels. She had always moved between hotels, but now the hotels were not glamorous staging posts between adventures. They were simply where she lived. Beverly Hills. Los Angeles. The Beverly Wilshire, which is where, on the 11th of May, 1979, she died in a suite on an upper floor, surrounded by half-empty glasses of Coca-Cola and books she may or may not have been reading. Chapter 8. What the money meant and what it could not buy. The accounting of Barbara Hutton's fortune has occupied financial historians and biographers for decades, partly because it is extraordinary and partly because it is, in its way, instructive. $50 million in 1933. $3,500 at death. The arithmetic of the dissipation is staggering, but it is also, when laid out carefully, comprehensible. The husbands took a great deal. Not all of them were mercenary in the same way, but almost all of them cost her substantially, through settlements and gifts and the general financial ecosystem that develops around a very wealthy woman with inconsistent legal advice. Alexis Mdivani, approximately $1 million. Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, several million in legal fees and settlement, in addition to what he spent during the marriage. Rubirosa, the estate, the polo ponies, the sports cars, and the disputed check. Trubetskoy von Kram and Doan were less expensive, relatively speaking. The taxes took a great deal more. Barbara was the inheritor of a fortune that predated the modern American tax code, and the taxes levied on that fortune as it transferred and as her income accumulated were, by the estimates of those who have reconstructed them, substantial. She was not well advised on tax matters. This is a mild way of saying that several of the people nominally responsible for her financial management failed her significantly. The gifts she gave away were genuine and enormous. The households she maintained across 8 countries over 4 decades were expensive. The renovations of Sidi Hosni alone cost millions over the years she owned it. The jewelry she purchased, the great pieces, the Empress Josephine emeralds and the rope of natural pearls, and the dozens of other extraordinary objects, cost millions more, though the jewelry was at least resaleable, and was, in fact, largely sold back over the final 2 decades of her life when cash became a more pressing concern than objects. The sedatives cost her, too, though this is harder to quantify. Not in dollars but in years, in choices made in states of diminished clarity, in relationships managed at a remove from her own best judgment. What the money demonstrably could not buy was the one thing she spent her life looking for. Safety. Not financial safety. She understood, for most of her life, that financial safety was effectively hers, at least in theory. The safety she was looking for was the emotional kind, the kind that comes from being known and loved without conditions, the kind that a mother provides to a child in those first years when the child cannot yet provide it for themselves. She had been denied this at 8 years old and had been searching for it, through 7 husbands and dozens of houses and thousands of parties, for the remaining 58 years of her life. What she found in those final years in the hotel suite, we can only approximate from the accounts of the few people who saw her. She had books. She had Coca-Cola. She had the quiet that she had spent most of her life running from and had now, apparently, made a kind of peace with. Whether that peace was resignation or something more genuine is not something any biographer can fully determine. She died at 66, which is not old. Her grandfather had built an empire. Her mother had died young and badly. Her son had died young, in a plane falling from a Colorado sky. She died in a hotel room, which is where she had, in a meaningful sense, always been. Chapter 9. The Jewels, a Parallel History. To understand Barbara Hutton without understanding her jewelry is to understand a poem without the imagery. Technically possible but fundamentally incomplete. The jewels were not merely ornaments. They were a parallel autobiography, a running record of her emotional life expressed in the most durable medium available. She began acquiring seriously in the 1930s, once her inheritance came fully into her hands, and her taste was from the beginning both extraordinary and characteristically counter to whatever was fashionable at the moment. She loved historical pieces, gems that had belonged to figures from other centuries, that carried histories of their own. A rope of natural pearls said to have been assembled in part from the collection of Empress Josephine. Emeralds of Mughal origin, set and reset over decades as her tastes evolved. Diamonds with provenances that made auction house specialists straighten slightly when they described them. The jewels were acquired at the peaks of her wealth and sold at the nadirs. The pattern, charted across 4 decades, reads like a fever graph. The purchases marking moments of relative stability or hope, the sales marking moments of financial pressure or emotional crisis. There is something almost unbearably honest about this record. She could manage the truth about her situation in the jewelry accounts in a way she could not always manage it in her behavior or her choices. She sold the famous pearl rope in the early 1970s. The emeralds went to auction in pieces over several years. The Hutton Divani necklace, a piece of such extraordinary beauty and historical significance that it is still discussed by gemologists and collectors, sold after her death for a figure that confirmed what everyone who had tracked the jewelry had suspected. The pieces were extraordinary by any standard, real in a way that much of her life was not, and their loss was a genuine subtraction from the world of beautiful things. She gave some of the jewelry away, too, as she gave everything away. To friends, to people whose need moved her, to her daughter-in-law, to women she encountered in moments of unexpected intimacy, who seemed to her to require something beautiful and permanent. The giving of jewelry was her most private language, the way she said things that she could not organize into words. The poetry was the other private language. She continued writing it into the final years of her life, though the later work is less accessible than the earlier poems and has been published only in fragments. What the fragments show is a mind still precise, still paying attention, still finding the exact word for the exact feeling. She had not, beneath the sedatives and the isolation and the grief, lost the acuity that had always been her most important possession. She was always, underneath everything, a poet. It is worth saying this again, because the public record buries it so thoroughly under the marriages and the money that it is possible to read 20 accounts of her life and encounter it only in passing, as a footnote, as a charming detail. It was not a detail. It was the truest thing about her. The jewels had other owners before her. They have other owners now. But no one else's relationship with them was quite like hers. Not as investment vehicles or status signals or insulation against the fear of poverty, but as evidence. Evidence that beauty existed. Evidence that something in the world had been made with care and would endure. It was enough sometimes. It was never quite enough. Chapter 10. The Press and the Invention of Poor Little Rich Girl. The phrase poor little rich girl was coined in 1930, attached itself to Barbara Hutton in 1930, and followed her for the remaining 49 years of her life with the cheerful, pitiless fidelity of a well-trained hound. She loathed it. This is documented in interviews, in letters, in the accounts of people who knew her. She found it reductive, condescending, and this was the part that genuinely wounded her, untrue, in the specific way that a caricature is untrue, which is not that it bears no resemblance to the original, but that it flattens the original into something easily managed and easily dismissed. The American press of the 1930s and 1940s was, in its treatment of Barbara Hutton, not covering a person. It was covering an idea. The idea was wealth as tragedy, fortune as punishment, the heiress as cautionary tale. This was a story Americans were hungry for during and after the Depression, a period in which the existence of $50 million fortunes was both fascinating and infuriating to a public that was standing in breadlines. The narrative the press constructed, stupid rich girl who cannot hold on to her money or her marriages, served a satisfying cultural function. It made the inequality legible, morally coherent. She deserved her unhappiness because she had done nothing to earn her happiness. This is, of course, a narrative built on several false premises. Barbara Hutton had not chosen her inheritance any more than the people in the breadlines had chosen their poverty. She had not designed the debut that made her a target. She had not sought the press attention that followed her everywhere she went. She had been placed by birth and the decisions of other people into a position of extraordinary financial privilege, and she had then attempted to live inside that position in the way that any person attempts to live, by finding love, by creating beauty, by enduring the things that hurt. The press, however, was not interested in nuance. Nuance does not sell newspapers. The poor little rich girl sold newspapers, and so the poor little rich girl she remained. What the press coverage did to her psychologically is difficult to measure, but easy to imagine. She was, from her debut onward, subject to an unrelenting public narrative about who she was and what she deserved. Every marriage was covered as a new installment of the same story. Another mistake, another failure, further evidence that money cannot buy happiness, thank God. Every divorce was proof of the thesis. Every purchase, every party, every photograph taken in a hotel lobby or on a yacht was filed in the public archive under the same heading. Poor little rich girl. She responded to this in the way that most people respond to sustained public characterization of their private self, by retreating further into that private self. The jewelry and the palaces were in one sense a retreat, beautiful, controllable environments where she set the terms. The poetry was a retreat. Tangier was a retreat. The sedatives eventually were a retreat. She gave very few interviews. The interviews she did give are remarkable for their intelligence and their careful refusal to give the interviewer what the interviewer was looking for. The breakdown, the confession, the confirmation that yes, money cannot buy happiness, and yes, she is the living proof. She deflected with humor. She redirected with questions. She was, in interviews, formidably controlled. In private, the people who knew her described someone quite different. Unguarded, funny, intensely curious, capable of great warmth and surprising self-awareness. She knew, those who loved her consistently report, exactly what was happening. She understood her situation. She understood, often, the nature of the people around her even when she chose to remain with them. Understanding is not the same as being able to change. This is a truth about human behavior that Barbara Hutton's story illustrates with painful clarity. She was not ignorant of her patterns. She was not unable to see herself with some accuracy. She simply could not, given the architecture of her emotional life, given the 8-year-old girl who had lost her mother and never fully re-established her footing, translate understanding into different choices. This is not unique to wealthy women. It is a human condition, distributed across every economic class. Barbara Hutton's version of it was simply conducted at a scale and visibility that made it seem exotic, when really it was ordinary. Devastating and ordinary. Chapter 11. Tangier and the only place she was free. There is a photograph of Barbara Hutton in the garden of Sidi Hosni that is different from every other photograph of her. She is not posed. She is not performing. She is sitting in the garden she planted herself. In a city that asked nothing of her social identity, in a place she had made with her own money and her own taste and her own care. And she is laughing at something someone just outside the frame has said. She looks, in this photograph, like herself. Or at least like the self she was when the performance could be suspended. Tangier was, for Barbara Hutton, the closest thing to home she ever found. And the fact that she found it in a Moroccan Medina rather than in any of the European or American cities where her life was officially conducted says something important about where she was most able to breathe. The international zone's peculiar lack of rigid social hierarchy, the way it had attracted people from dozens of countries and cultures who were, to varying degrees, inventing themselves in its tolerant obscurity, suited her in ways that London and New York and Paris never did. In those cities, she was always the Woolworth heiress. She was always the poor little rich girl, the series of famous marriages, the declining fortune. She could not enter a room in those cities without the room responding to its idea of her rather than to her actual presence. In Tangier, in the early years, she was simply Barbara, a foreign woman of obvious means who had purchased a palace in the Medina, who spoke some Arabic, who knew the vendors in the souk by name, who planted a garden with her own hands and spent hours in it. The city's residents were accustomed to foreigners of unusual circumstances. She was not the most remarkable person in Tangier by any measure, and this relative anonymity, purchased not with disguise but with genuine engagement, was more valuable to her than any of the jewelry. She spent decades renovating and perfecting Sidi Hosni. Each of the 17 rooms of the palace reflected her aesthetic with a specificity that made it clear the decisions were hers. The Moroccan textiles combined with pieces from her travels in Asia, the garden laid out in a pattern she had designed herself after studying Islamic garden architecture, the guest quarters arranged to make visitors feel both welcomed and given sufficient privacy. The palace was, in a way that no other property she had ever owned was, an expression of a coherent self. When she sold it, in the mid-1970s, those who loved her understood that something had ended. The sale was financial necessity, at least in part. The fortune was by then genuinely diminished, and the maintenance of Sidi Hosni was not inexpensive. But those close to her suggest that it was also something more than financial necessity. It was surrender. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but quiet and final. The surrender of the self that had planted the garden and named the rooms and spent happy hours in the souk, because that self required a context she could no longer sustain. She moved to hotels after the sale of Sidi Hosni, and in the hotels she was again, as she had always been everywhere outside of Tangier, primarily performing, managing, getting through the days with the tools available to her. The books, the Coca-Cola, the sedatives that kept the worst of the inner noise below the level of intolerance. She was by the final years very thin and very quiet and reading enormously. The books she ordered in those years, delivered to the hotel suite, stacked beside the bed and around the room, covered an extraordinary range. History, poetry, natural science, philosophy, biography. She had not surrendered her mind. The mind was the last thing she held on to, as the money went and the husbands went and Lance went and Tangier went, and the mind held on until the heart stopped. On the 11th of May, 1979, the heart stopped. She was 66 years old, and she had been, for almost 60 years, one of the most famous women in the world. The news of her death appeared in the back sections of the newspapers that bothered to run it. The obituaries repeated the familiar details. The $50 million, the 7 husbands, the 3,500. They called her the poor little rich girl, one final time in the headlines. She had spent her entire life trying to become something other than a headline. She did not entirely succeed. But the attempt, the poetry, the garden in Tangier, the gifts given without record or expectation of return, the books stacked to the ceiling of the hotel room. The attempt was real, and it was hers, and it deserves to be remembered alongside the deficit. Chapter 12, The Inheritance of Ruin, What Barbara Hutton Leaves Behind. Barbara Hutton's estate, at death, was settled in a matter that was administratively almost simpler than any of her marriages. $3,500 does not require complex legal management. There were debts. There were obligations to several members of her household staff, which were honored by her trustees. There were the final hotel bills. There were the stacks of books, which were inventoried and dispersed. The jewelry, the great pieces of it, had been gone for years. The palaces, Sidi Hosni and Tangier, the London townhouse, the various European properties, had been sold. The cars and the yachts that had populated the middle decades of her life had long since passed to other owners. What she left behind, beyond the immediate accounting, was considerably more durable. The pearl necklace that passed through auction houses after her death, the Hutton Devani necklace, a piece of staggering historical significance, was eventually purchased by a private collector for a figure that, adjusted for the decades since, would approach $50 million. The specific objects she had loved were not, it turned out, diminished by her losses. They had their own value, independent of her catastrophes. They endured in the way that beautiful things endure. Her poetry was published in collected form after her death, and the critical response, muted because she was Barbara Hutton and critical response to Barbara Hutton had always been filtered through the poor little rich girl lens, was nonetheless clear on the essential point. The work was real. Not the work of a dilettante seeking an artistic identity to supplement a social one. The work of a person who had been paying serious and sustained attention to language her entire life and had found, in it, the one territory where her internal experience could be expressed with complete honesty. The $3,500 is, understandably, the number most associated with her death. It is a devastating number. It is also considered carefully, slightly misleading as a measure of ruin. The $50 million had not all been stolen or wasted or given to predatory husbands, though some of it had. Much of it had been lived on, across decades, in the way that people live, on shelter and food and travel and the maintenance of relationships, however imperfect those relationships were. She had been alive for 66 years. She had been extraordinarily alive, feeling more intensely, perhaps, than was comfortable, paying more attention than the world rewarded, loving more completely than the people she loved usually returned. The $3,500 at the end does not erase the $50 million that preceded it. any more than the 50 million erased the grief. They coexist. They're both true. And the life that generated both of them was, underneath the headlines and the marriages and the spectacular arithmetic of ruin, a human life. Complicated, lonely, marked by genuine beauty and genuine suffering, and entirely its own. Chapter 13. Why Barbara Hutton Still Matters. It would be easy and not entirely wrong to read Barbara Hutton's life as a cautionary tale. 50 million to 3,500. 7 marriages, none of them what she was looking for. A palace sold. A son buried. A hotel room at the end. The cautionary tale reading is satisfying in the way that cautionary tales are always satisfying. It imposes narrative order on what is actually the chaotic collision of character, circumstance, and chance. It allows us to identify the mistakes, enumerate them, and assure ourselves that we would not make them. But the more honest reading of her life is more uncomfortable and more useful. Barbara Hutton was not primarily undone by extravagance or poor financial management, though both of those things happened. She was undone, to the extent that a person can be undone rather than simply shaped by their circumstances, by the loss of her mother at 8 years old, in a family that did not speak of what had happened and did not provide the kind of sustained, attentive love that might have helped her build something to lean on when the world pressed against her. She was undone, secondarily, by the gap between who she was and who the world was determined to see. The world saw the Woolworth heiress. The world saw the poor little rich girl. The world saw the woman with 7 husbands and the $50 million fortune running through her fingers. The world did not see the poet in the garden in Tangier, the woman who knew the vendors in the souk by name, the 8-year-old who had lost her mother and spent the rest of her life building versions of the safety that loss had taken from her. What Barbara Hutton leaves us is not, ultimately, the arithmetic of wealth lost. The arithmetic is dramatic and will continue to be cited and marveled at. What she leaves us is a question about attention, about who we attend to, who we see fully, who we reduce to a number and a headline and a nickname they despise. She deserved better attention than she received from her husbands and from history. She paid, all her life, the kind of extraordinary attention to the world that we admire in poets and philosophers. She wrote it down. She left evidence. She was the poor little rich girl. She was also, and more truly, Barbara. If you found this story remarkable, subscribe for more histories of the extraordinary, the forgotten, and the permanently misunderstood. The past is never as simple as it looks.